everyone to this session. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm literally going to speak for a couple of minutes and then hand over to these fabulous people because they've got such an interesting subject to share with you. But I just wanted to tell you, firstly, a little bit about the Think Ahead programme, because I think it's really interesting and I think it really shows kind of the trust and the way that they are investing into social workers. So the Think Ahead itself is 8 years old, it's charity funded, and there's cohorts of students all over the countries in trust and local authority placements. Practically how it works is these guys are on a 2-year programme, so they're in their first year. This is the first year that we've done it, and their placements are in the LMHTs in Nottingham City. They've also done a contrast learning experience which was in CAMHS, and that involved 5 days in Nottingham City local authority children's teams, so they're getting lots of experience. And also they're training to do their masters over the 2 years as well. So it's intense and it's a real blended mix of being at university, being on placement, and just learning as they go, really. So next year they'll be employed by the trust and they'll be doing their ASYE programme. And then at the end of the 2 years, we really hope that they'll stay and that they'll want to be mental health social workers within the teams that they are now. And that's really the reason that I wanted to share this with you, because if we think of the NHS long-term plan, like I know that we already have amazing pockets of social work happening around the trust with you guys, and if we think of the plan about strengthening the workforce by bringing that diversity, those different perspectives, those different professions, like social work is very much part of that plan, and Think Ahead is very much part of that as well. So for me, it's just really exciting that they've kind of invested in Think Ahead. We are doing it again next year in the Mid-Knots area. So there'll be another cohort of students in the LMHTs in Mid-Knots. So again, this is me just doing a little bit of a plug. I'm the consultant social worker leading on that. And if you are interested in that role, please have a chat with me because we are looking for that person at the moment. But for me, I just think it's really exciting how actually the trust are recognising the real value that social workers and the way that we think and the way that we do things, and this might already be the experiences in your team, but the way that they can really support to really actually enable that MDT way of working. So it's exciting times. So I'm going to hand over to these guys now, and yeah, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for the introduction, Heather. I'm just going to share our PowerPoint presentation, hopefully without any problems. So people are able to see that, if you could give me a shout if you can.
Yeah.
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 Great.
Yeah.
Lovely. And I'll hand over to Brogan to introduce the presentation.
Hi everyone, thank you for attending our presentation today. So today we'll be focusing on the transition from CAMHS to adult mental health services. So the main points of the presentation today will include what is transition, what research has already been done on transition. We will then be hearing from a young person called Rebecca who has experienced transition personally. We will then explore the challenges of transition within the trust and speak about good practice of transition and development within the trust. And finally, we'll be giving some key takeaway points which can help social workers to promote the transition process and support young people who are transitioning. So whilst we are presenting, if you would like to have a think about the transitions within your team or those you have seen during your professional career and write your thoughts in the chat box, we can come back to these at the end of the presentation. Next slide, Chris, please. Okay, so we are, oh, sorry, if you just go back, Chris. So we are going to be using some acronyms today throughout the presentation. So this is just a list of those, just so you are aware of them. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is transition? So transition is a process in which something changes from one state to another. Transition is a passage from one state, stage, subject or place to another. It's a change or a movement, a development or evolution from one form, stage or style to another. So I'm now going to hand over to Charlotte, who's going to talk about some of the research that has been already done on transition.
So there are 4 optimum features of transition, and only 4% of young people actually experienced all of these 4 features. So the 4 features of optimum transition are that the young person is fully informed for their care to move to a new service. There is a joint meeting between services and the young person, so that would be the CAMHS and the Adult Mental Health Service. There is a period of handover or joint care between the 2 services, and that the young person's information is fully transferred to the new service. Next slide, please, Chris.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of a technical issue here. 1 second. I'm going to try and go back into it. Oh dear. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, that's the next slide, Charlotte. Sorry about that.
Thank you. So transitions can have a few issues, so it can be problematic for a range of reasons across different settings and countries. So there is a lack of leadership within transitions. Transition age adolescents are often not prioritised, and young adults tend to disengage after transition due to the perceptions of adult mental health and the stigma and labels that are attached to mental health. There's also a difference in care philosophies between CAMHS and adult mental health. So CAMHS is seen as quite nurturing, with a focus on emotional and developmental disorders, whereas adult mental health focuses on things such as severe mental illness like psychosis and bipolar disorder. And there's also a strict criteria for adult mental health services. Next slide, please, Chris. So how can we change this? So creating a youth-friendly services that extends the age boundary to 25 as opposed to just stopping at 18 years of age. The introduction of joint clinics to improve the transition pathway between CAMHS and adult mental health services. And implementing the 4 features of optimum transition in transitions. Next slide, please, Chris. So in summary, there are 4 features of optimum transition, but only 4% of young people have actually experienced all of these. There are differences in the care philosophies between adult mental health and CAMHS, which can make transitions a struggle. And that youth-friendly services that cater for young people up to the age of 25 could alter boundaries, as well as joint clinics, which may be beneficial. So now I'm going to pass you on to Sean.
So we thought it'd be beneficial to talk about the experience of a young person who's gone through the transition from CAMHS to adult mental health services. So I'm just going to briefly talk to you about Rebecca, who wrote a blog on her experiences. She spoke about how initially she felt apprehensive about the transition from CAMHS to adult mental health services, and this was mainly due to hearing quite a lot of bad stories from other young people who had done the transition. And I think this can be quite a common feeling that is felt among young people who are about to transition. Prior to the transition, Rebecca said how she met with her CAMHS therapist, her new therapist from the adult team, and her parents in a meeting all together to discuss Rebecca's progress and her therapy. And Rebecca assumed that this, in addition to having her notes handed over, meant that she'd be able to continue the therapy where she left off in CAMHS. But she found that this wasn't the case, and she had to restart the therapy and felt like she just had to retell her story again. And she spoke about how she found this quite frustrating and it didn't help the transition process. And she found the transition quite hard and saw that there was a big change in the support she received. She was expected to be more independent, and there was less support from the team and less parental involvement. And this came as quite unexpected to Rebecca. And this didn't help the transition process, as she wasn't aware that these changes would happen. And I think this is something that as professionals and the services can learn from to ensure that young people are informed and aware of the changes in the treatment they'll experience, just so they're prepared for the transition. And additionally, Rebecca spoke about how, as part of struggling with the transition, she actively avoided the new adult mental health team. And I think as practitioners, it could be helpful to be mindful of this when working with newly transitioned young people, just to be supportive and patient with them and understand that they might be a bit apprehensive at first, but it's not them choosing to disengage with the service, it's just them coming to terms with the transition. And Rebecca outlined her hopes for a smoother transition between CAMHS and adult mental health services for future young people, and to do this with a clear handover and the ability to continue therapy where it left off. And I think as practitioners, we can use Rebecca's experiences to learn from and support young people who are in the process of transitioning teams. And then we'll pass you on to Sarah now.
Next slide, Chris. Excellent, thank you. So a lot of the focus around transition work within the Trust came from the Commissioning for Quality and Innovation, also known as CQUIN, 2017 to 2019. And the goal was to improve the experience and outcomes for young people as they transition out of children and young people's mental health services. Next slide, Chris. So on the back of that, the Trust implemented transition champions. So there's one situated in each team. This was in addition to their duties, and champions were requested to collect data on young people who have transitioned through to adult mental health. Just going to pick up on a couple of points around this. So a lot of this was in addition to their duties, which obviously means that this is dependent on capacity, and obviously with heavy workloads, what takes the priority. Also, we need to consider that a lot of people move teams and leave jobs or move to other areas, and whether or not the roles are consistent and how is that taken account of. Looking at considering the transition through to adult mental health leaves a large proportion of young people who don't actually transition into the services. There's a big focus on who goes through, but actually, is it a bad thing? And if we're considering how smooth the transition is into other services other than adult mental health. Next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. So we've been working with some of the colleagues in both CAMHS and adult mental health to consider some of these challenges. I don't think any of us are wanting to add to any additional division between the services, but it is worth noting that there is a distinctive difference. And I think Charlotte mentioned that in her research. So some of the themes and the challenges that came from CAMHS were the threshold of adult mental health services and also the range of services available, and what happens when a child or young person moves out of area, for instance, going to university. In CAMHS, there's a reluctance to pathologise, very therapeutic approach, focusing on the emotional and behavioural responses of the young person, and also has a real family focus, as Sian said, especially around parents. Adult mental health, the themes and the challenges they highlighted were the timeliness of the referrals coming in, the change of service and the expectations around what a service would look like. It's a very diagnostic approach, focusing on the clusters with a real individual focus. Next slide, please, Chris. Thank you. On a positive though, both CAMHS and adult mental health services acknowledge that when a transition move was planned and communication took place, it goes really well. And this was even if a young person found the transition struggle, it was able to be contained and the transition ran smoothly. So I'm going to hand over to Chris now.
Hello everyone, yeah, I'm Chris. So in this section of the talk, I'm just going to talk through a case study of some good practice around transitions within the Trust, which is the Community Eating Disorders Transition Pathway. And then I'm just going to touch briefly on a couple of really positive developments we've heard about in preparation for this talk that we think it'd be helpful for you to know about. So firstly, the CAMHS, the Adult Mental Health Community Eating Disorders Transition Pathway. So CAMHS and Adult Mental Health ED share a dedicated Band 7 transitions worker called Laura Eccleston, who we spoke to in preparation for this talk. So she works with everyone from the age of 17 accessing the service, and she can continue working with young people up to the age of 20. So Laura's actually working across both teams, and she's got strong links to both MDTs. So she describes herself as sometimes being an adult mental health worker in a children's team, and sometimes a children's mental health worker in an adults team. So there's this idea of her adapting her approach based on the young person's needs, taking into account things like differences in maturity between young people. So Laura's got a real focus on continuity of care throughout this flexible transition period. And she's using a really flexible, assertive outreach approach. And that might be one-to-one work lasting throughout the transition, or it might be like a shorter piece of consultation work to prepare young people for transition. But yeah, flexibility is kind of the key to this work. Sorry, something's just popped up. Can everyone still see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's very nerve-wracking not being able to see any of the audience, and with all the technological stuff going on. So there you go. So 3 areas that Laura highlighted as really supporting successful transitions within the community ED pathway. Firstly, the service structure itself seems to really support successful transitions, in that there's joint management in CAMHS and adult mental health eating disorders, allowing real management oversight of that whole transitions process. So the specialist practitioner post itself is shared between budgets for adults and children, and there's a real investment in these dedicated transitions roles. So as well as the specialist transitions practitioner role, there's also a band 4 occupational therapy assistant role to give practical support with this work. So managing relationships and expectations is also seen as really key to the transitions process. So young people transitioning to adult mental health are going to be used to CAMHS. They're going to be used to CAMHS practitioners using a much more sort of nurturing, quite assertive approach. Whereas with adults, adult workers are more likely to be using sort of collaborative, partnership-based approaches and really promoting independence. So Laura's taken a really flexible approach throughout this transition period to engage and support young people as they make that transition towards having to take a bit more responsibility for their care, and really just supporting them to navigate this change in expectation. And early planning and preparation are also seen as really important. And in the community eating disorders transition pathway, Laura keeps track of everyone in CAMHS who's due to turn 17, so that she can be really proactive in terms of planning and identifying need as soon as possible. So as soon as they turn 17, she can start that process. And I was just going to talk about some really positive developments within the trust around transitions that we thought it'd be helpful for you to know about. So firstly, the Neurodevelopmental Specialist Service, or NES. So a common challenge within transitions is that the range of services available to young people in CAMHS isn't replicated in adult services, which I think we've touched on already in the presentation. And this has particularly historically been the case for young people with autistic spectrum condition and ADHD, which these 2 conditions were previously understood as being childhood disorders. So it's really positive and encouraging to hear that there is a new service called the Neurodevelopmental Specialist Service, which is a integrated service for adults with ADHD and ASC, and it's going to be running from next month. So it's recognising the overlap in neurodevelopmental disorders and seeking to develop clearer assessment and treatment pathways for these conditions in kind of a combined integrated service. And then the other thing we wanted to draw your attention to was that within the Trust's personality disorder pathway, there's a new post, which is the transition practitioner post. and Rebecca Farrow's taken on that new role, and we also spoke to Rebecca in preparation for this presentation. And essentially, it's a new role that's been developed to support young people making the transition to adult services in the personality disorder pathway. So it's specifically an adult mental health based post, but similar to the eating disorders pathway, Rebecca's seeking to build really strong links between CAMHS and adult mental health. So now I'm going to pass you over to Brogan, who's going to give you some key kind of practice takeaways for your practice.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, so what social workers can do to support individuals who transition. So it's about mainly understanding the young person and their families and the experience that they've gone through, and recognise that this can be a very destabilising and difficult time for that young person and their families. Early planning is also very important when supporting young people through transition. Young people and also their families again, they need as much time as possible to prepare for the transition to help them know what to expect. Taking a flexible and assertive approach, so taking into account different levels of maturity, recognising that this is a common point of disengagement from help when a young person does transition, and recognising flexibility and approach is important for young people moving into a more partnership based model of care as they get used to taking more responsibility for their care. And what we notice that communication between teams is also another key aspect of transition, and ensuring that the young person's notes are transferred over. Thank you for attending our presentation today on transition.
Brilliant. I'm just going to stop sharing our presentation now. So I think we've we thought it'd be if anyone's got any questions for us on transitions, we'd be helpful to we'd be open to having a bit of the discussion. And if anyone's got any comments that they wanted to put in the chat about maybe their own experience of transitions, what's good, what's bad, what helps, we thought that might be helpful too. Great, so there's a comment here. I found this really helpful when thinking about my responsibility within that process when working with people.
Okay.
Good stuff. Yeah. I think one thing for me that I really got out of kind of preparing for this was that recognizing that people might need a kind of a slightly different approach to what we'd usually use within adult services, and just recognizing that within sort of our MDT meetings and referral meetings, and bringing that perspective into to discussions was a real takeaway for me. And we've got a comment from Angela: youth offending teams to probation, HMYOIs to adult prison. Needed to look at young adult offenders 17 to 25. Is there anything you wanted to say a bit more about that, Angela?
So, just looking back at what I came into, that I think adult offending teams and probation recognised that was a group that when they transition, failing, similar to the experiences you were saying, is that expectation change. It's like from 17, team overnight. They could be response to pay attention to literacy, the same things about parents. And then they wondered why that group kept either being failing or being taken back to regional, and it's saying things that you've identified and adult mental health services. So they recognize got to work around transition.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, I didn't quite catch all of that. Your mic was quite quiet, but it seemed to really that's okay. It seemed to really reflect some of what we found kind of in prep for the presentation, particularly about kind of parents, I think, and you mentioned parents, didn't you, and how quickly they're going from being in a position of having lots of responsibility for the care of their child to not being quite so involved in a very short space of time, even though materially things are going to be probably quite things are probably going to be quite similar.
Yeah, I think you used to, when they were in the yacht, you'd copy all the letters and correspondence involved the parents, and then when they transferred, they were expected to get put to appointments on their own, and it's like they've suddenly matured overnight, and some struggled with that. It's different expectations in the different services.
I think that's a really good point, Angela, because I find it's often within the services, it's when they turn 18, it's as if you said overnight a lot of changes happen, when actually it's only 24 hours and they're not any different to how they were that day before their 18th birthday, but the amount of responsibility they have changes drastically.
Yeah.
And we've got a comment from Emma. Thank you, Emma. So Emma's saying, so important we get it right for people within impact. We have tried to get this right for young people, but recognise we can write all the SOPs in the world, but it is important they are implemented. Absolutely. And I guess for me that kind of relates a bit to what Sarah touched on about transitions champions. So we've kind of implemented these roles, but unless you've got kind of the dedicated time and the energy to put into that work and to put into this young group of people, then it's only as good as kind of the energy you put into it, isn't it? Did you want to say any more about that, Emma?
No, not really. I think you covered it in your presentation. I just think we're very good at writing things down, and we need to go into action a bit more. And I think it's about challenging some of that culture that's existed. I don't think there's many people around that would disagree that it's important that we get transitions right, but I think too often day-to-day busyness gets in the way of managing that in the right way, and that important communication. So I think it's just about continuing to challenge about why isn't this happening, and having the right support in place to enable those things to happen properly as well, because it's like I say, it's not that people don't want to get it right. I mean, it'd be very worrying if people didn't want to get it right. It's about resource sometimes. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Lovely.
I think we've actually come to the end of our allocated time, and there's the next session is just starting, so I think we might leave it there for now. Sorry, Biant, I see you've got your hand up, but
no worries. Just quickly to say, really useful session, guys. I really found that helpful. I mean, it resonated a lot with me because I was a transition social worker in mid-Nottinghamshire for about 12 years with the Community Learning Disability team. And one of the key points, I think, for me was for the schools to kind of embrace person-centered thinking, for the young person to be in the centre of the process of their transition. And a lot of work was done with schools within the Mansfield area, specialist schools as well as the mainstream schools, to kind of embed that kind of thinking, and that's kind of paid off. So it wasn't a kind of cliff edge situation when young people were moving through transition into adulthood, and the things were in place for them. And I think that relationship is so important to get that right, to walk with young people, shoulder to shoulder as they come through that journey as becoming adults, you know what I mean? And involving the parents and the carers as well, and linking into community resources. So yeah, that's it really took me back, and thank you for that experience. Brilliant.
Thank you very much, Bjorn. Yeah, nice to hear from you.
Nice one.
Brilliant. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending today, and hope to be in touch in future.